Welcome to PolyTheism. My name is Justin.
And I'm Sandra.
And PolyTheism is a podcast at the intersection of sexuality, identity, relationships, and spirituality. If you're seeking a deeper spiritual connection in these areas of your life, we're hoping to be companions on your journey.
Whether you've been hurt by religion and are looking for healing, identify with a faith tradition and are looking outside of the box, identify as spiritual but not religious and want more, or are looking for meaning beyond what is in your life, we believe we can do this together.
Through love, curiosity, and wonder. PolyTheism is a podcast about not just spirituality, but sexuality, which means that we're going to be covering adult topics, and that may include topics that are sensitive to some listeners. If at any time you feel triggered or emotionally overwhelmed because of what we're talking about, please pause the podcast and seek those who love and support you.
And also, though Justin is a professional chaplain, neither of us are professional counselors. So understand that our approach to this is our approach, and that your approach might differ, as well as the approach of other people. By all means, seek out other views on things.
We may get things wrong. We always seek to be inclusive and mindful about anybody who we're engaging. At the same time, we're not going to always get it right. And so please, with a spirit of generosity, let us know if we have gotten something wrong, and we'll seek to make amends.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, Sandra.
How are you doing?
I am currently moving households.
I thought so.
Along with my nesting partner and my 10-year-old. It's amazing how many things three people can accumulate over 10 years.
I bet. When we cleaned out my mom's house, I've told you this, we had to clean out 2 dumpsters full of things. And my mom kept things neat and clean, but it was hard. It was really hard. I threw away over 1,000 books that nobody would take. I threw away, I'm not kidding, over 50. I stopped counting at 50 Christmas sweaters. I found boxes from my Christmas presents when I was 7. It's amazing how we can accumulate things. I know that that's not what we're talking about today, but we have accumulated someone today to help us out. Lee Harrington has joined us. I have your website up right here, Lee. So I'm just going to read a tiny little bit of it. Lee Harrington is a spiritual and erotic authenticity educator, gender explorer, eclectic artist, and award-winning author and editor on erotic and sacred experience. He brings a combination of playful engagement and thoughtful academic dialogue to a broad audience and believes we are each beautifully complex ecosystems who deserve to examine the human experience from that lens. I can personally say that I have known Lee since 1997 for a very long time in a lot of different environments. And Lee, you've never ceased to amaze me. You just forge your own path, you create your own ground, it just amazes me. So I'm so thrilled that you were willing to come and talk to us.
Oh, I am so excited to get to be here, both that our histories of knowing each other, but this continue weaving in and out of journeys. For folks who are listening, maybe you have those people in your world where you can, you know them in this realm, and suddenly you know them in this realm, and you know them in this realm, and yet the thread doesn't stop. It is still the same thread that is weaving, even if it's in a different part of the tapestry. And I love that about how we just keep finding each other along the way.
Yeah, you reminded me of a story, as a matter of fact, where we were in a different environment than when we first met. And you were like, oh my goodness, Sandra, have you met Nick? You really should meet him. And the people around were giggling because they're like, you do know that they're married, right? But because in the kink environment instead of in gaming,
Right. And that's the other thing too, is that I joke that when I meet someone, I don't know which name to use because is it the Ren Fair name? Is it the sci-fi convention name? Is it the pagan community name? Is it your kink scene name? Is your government document name? Is it the nickname you use with your closest friends? I have no idea. So I just let other people introduce themselves to each other.
That's really smart.
Which also lets me cover about the 20% of names that I've forgotten. I'm just
Oh,
like, this is just
that's
easier. Here, introduce yourself.
such a
And
classy way of dealing with the fact that, like, we all forget names.
we all forget names, but it also gives grace for people to be able to introduce themselves the way they choose to. And as somebody who's transgender, I was assigned female at birth, and I walk in the world as the fabulous gender adventurer guy that I am. It also gives space for people who are on the next chapter of self identity, whether that's changing your last name during a marriage, whether that is using a new nickname because you don't go by that name anymore, whether you're on a gender journey. It allows for all of that stuff too.
Yeah, and gives me an opportunity to bring up the fact that I don't know if you know this, Lee, but the very first class on gender affirming sex for trans people that I ever took was your class. I think it's back in
Oh.
2013. And it was so good. I kept telling everybody, I had a whole lot of friends. That was about the time that people stopped using or started using something other than bisexual,
Mm-hmm.
is the term I grew up with. So there was a lot of interest in, how do you approach sexuality and sexual interaction with someone who is trans? And I remember that. I still remember so much about that class. It was so good.
Well, and if we talk about one of the things that the three of us were discussing before we even came on together was this intersection of sexuality or kink in combination with spirit and paganism and energy work and all of that stuff. It's the complexities of language that allow us the ability to interact with each other, but also in the case of the word bisexual, shuts down some of the conversation. Right. When I talk between conversations of kinky Christians and kinky pagans, there's this perception that they're doing different things, but no, they're just doing different words.
Yeah.
That the words get they're not just an opportunity to discuss. Sometimes they get in the way of authentic connection.
And Lee, speaking about words and language and how they really help us communicate who we are, our identities, our being, what we want, what we need. What language do you use right now? Can you give us a story as the language that you grew up with and the language that you're using now?
So I'm very blessed that my mother was a goddess worshiping Lutheran. And when people would ask her, how does that work? She's like, God and I are fine. You don't need to worry about it. And my father was a born again Catholic. He chose to give up alcoholism and, as a chance to reclaim his Catholicism. I'll take it any day. And since they couldn't agree on how to raise me, they told me to go to everything. I went to mosque and synagogue and temple and danced in open fields and held serpents and prayed in groves and got to do all of these different things. I was a member of CUPS, the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. I was somebody who, my mother was a crystal healer. My grandmother knew her past lives going back 1,000+ years. And so I was in this matrilineal female line as at least 3, if not 4, 5, 6 women who did energy work of some sort, even if they didn't use those terms. So my mother gifted me my first tarot deck when I was 13 or 14. And so I got to have that as part of my journey. And being around all of this diversity gave me the gift of an array of language, but also gave me these moments where things tasted real or had no flavor to them.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What do you mean by tasted real or had no flavor?
So some people see energy, some people hear it, some people feel it. I experience it olfactory, smell and taste things, and as a primary sensory experience with energy. And when I say taste real, I remember going to this one synagogue and for a friend's bat mitzvah. And when I walked in there, my mouth just felt full of flavors that were unique to its space. But it was full, right? And I was just like, wow, is Judaism like this? But I went to a different synagogue and I'm like, nope, got nothing. So it wasn't about Judaism, it was about that space, and not just the space, the people who made that space and how they interacted with their practices. And there was a mosque that I went to in China where the moment I walked through the doors, I was like, oh, this place. And others that felt like no one loved them anymore. Where people were going through the steps. And the same thing happens in pagan spaces that I go to. There are some where I'm like, wow, dear ceremonial magicians, your work has no love in it. In the same way that there's cookies that taste like they have love in them, and cookies where you're like, I know it's technically the same recipe, but it's got nothing. Right? It's got nothing. And I felt the same way in an array of Wiccan spaces, in an array of Norse and or Asatru spaces. Like, it's not about the practice, it's about the presence. It's about the collaboration. It's about how the technologies that are being used interact with the spirit of who is in the room.
And Lee, by using the word technology, how do you apply that to spirituality?
Oh, I consider spiritualities technologies straight out. There are people for whom they learn best through reading. Some people are like, in the long form especially, they read books and they're able to absorb information. Other people are on the complete flip side. A TikTok collection of knowledge is how their brain absorbs quickly and efficiently. The audio video combination in short form enters their brain and anchors easily. There are people who learn through listening to podcasts like this. There are people who learn through collaboration and standing side by side with someone and doing the activity kinesthetically, right? With their hands, with their bodies. All of these are forms of technology. And in the world of spirituality, I think of, in Judaism, as an example, my partner is a devout Jew, so I spend a lot of time in those spaces right now. In Judaism, there are people who dive their spirit into studying the Talmud, studying Torah, being in it, reading all of the commentary from thousands of years of thought on the matters. Long form of long form of long form.
The essence of a hyperfocus.
Real. So real. And there's other people for whom going to Mass once a year, that's what they needed. One experience, immersive, with 100+ people surrounding you instead of reading alone in your house.
Right.
And I look at pagan practices that are similar, because people are used to those concepts in the world at large, but we don't talk about them in our pagan practices enough. So what would it be like for people? I know there was a group I got to attend one meeting of once in Massachusetts, and it was these old guys and my friend who was in his 20s, every single month taking 2 runes and doing deep dive studies for 1 month on the history of those runes, on examining how they appear in different books, on looking at how these 2 runes have deep spiritual as well as academic and theory behind them. And then they would get together for 3 to 5 hours and argue over mead, right? And just get angry, drunk old men arguing about ingas.
Right.
This was so amazing to see these Norse practitioners deep dive as their technological interaction compared to people I know who read runes, for whom how they got to know the runes was through casting them, was through doing readings, was through interacting with other people and seeing what came experientially. It's the same rune, 2 very different technological interactions.
Yeah,
very much so. Especially sometimes in theological spaces, and I come out of the Christian tradition, but now Unitarian Universalist, thinking of religion as taking up, sometimes we have orthodoxy and when we have orthopraxy. Orthodoxy meaning those practices, or in your terms, those technologies that look for what is the right way to orient mind, body, and spirit to align with what we have learned.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have orthopraxy, which means how do we take this technology and how do we live into it? How do we practice this in a kinesthetic and in a physical sense in the world, right? And there's no right or wrong, good or bad between these two. It's just many times religion and spirituality can sometimes lean either orthodoxic or orthopraxic,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I'm really digging the idea of the concept of all of the things that we use to practice spirituality being technologies that we bring to bear. It is something that we forget in our modern era, that at one point writing was a technology. It was a new technology. For goodness sakes, wheels are technology. The glasses that all three of us are wearing are technology. You know, we tend to think about it as something that's computer-based, but it is so much more than that. It is the pans that we use to cook our food, the books that we read, the way in which we are able to read them, and so much more.
Or even the use of fire.
Oh yeah, I guess that's technology too, huh?
And I think of, oh gosh, who was the musician? There's a song. It's a musician who goes through this list of all of the different ways people do divination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's cast cards. Let's throw runes. Let's be with the cowrie shells. But then goes into ones like, let's catch mercury in water. Let's look at the smoke and see what it has to say. Let us, bleed onto paper. Let us drink from a teacup. And it just goes over and over. Let's look at clouds. And it goes through this entire list of the ways people do this stuff, because nowadays people list some basic systems for divinatory practices.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, nah, what else we got? I recently went through my collection. I'm predominantly cartomancy, so tarot, oracle, Lenormand, Kipper, all these card-based systems. That's the main thing I collect. But I have other divinatory systems as well. And in my narrowing down of my collection, my unhauling, I realized I have 153 decks of some sort. But beyond that, I realized I have 2 obsidian spheres for doing trance oracular work. I have collections of coin for doing that sort of stuff. I have a little collection of trinkets and some casting cloths that were made from a cool human I followed back on Facebook, right? Like that kind of stuff, of all of these different things. And if we compare it to these different types of adventurous sexualities that get called kink, I got to go to a conference in Ohio, and one of the classes on the schedule was on Gorian slavery position. And I'm like, I know nothing about this, right? And when I see a thing on a schedule that I have no idea, I'm fascinated. I light up with a new possibility. And Gorian is a system of power exchange or authority transfer relationships, sometimes known as dominance and submission, or possession and ownership, right? There's these concepts, and they're entered into consensually. People are like, I want to engage with the notion of power. That's either a turn on, or it lights up my spirit, or I feel like I have more structure in my life if I get to do it. And so Gore is a system that was developed in the science fiction and fantasy world by a guy named John Norman back in the 60s and 70s. It's a series of, I think, 13 books, all about how Earth women are meant to be submissive or possessed by men from Gore, this faraway planet.
Yeah.
It's more complex than that, but it's a whole thing. And so this woman is at the front of the room teaching this class. And bless her, at the front of the class, she says, I know that my system of dominance and submission was made up by a science fiction author in the 60s and 70s, that it is completely designed and made up, but then looked at all of us and said, but your system is too.
Yeah. This comes very much back to what I was thinking about asking you is I think for a lot of people, they don't grow up with the kind of spiritual abundance that you did. They are taught that there is one way to think, one way to believe, one way to do things correctly. And I think that the same thing happens in a sexual sphere as well, is that everybody learns that there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Being able to break out of that and say, no, I'm going to take a little bit from here, a little bit from there, a little bit from another place. And I'm going to recognize the fact that this is something that I make for myself. How did you get there? Was that something that was just natural for you? Or did you actively get to a place where you're like, I am going to pick what works for me?
So in middle school, I referred to myself as being I love dodecahedron because I did not know the word polyamorous.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was into Will, who was with Lanisha, but Will was with Amanda, who got knocked up by Mike, who was also with, like the list just kept going. And then there was also just Thomas, who just hung out with our group.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was asexual. He looked like a young Art Garfunkel. Amazing, right? But I had that group growing up, and we didn't have a term for what we had.
Mm-hmm.
We just all knew we were together in some complex way. When I became a street punk, because it wasn't safe to be home, it wasn't a good fit. I never considered myself necessarily homeless, but I was definitely unhomed for a period of time. Mm-hmm. And during that time period, I met queer street punks and kinky people and weirdos and science fiction freaks that were crashing in different places. And I feel so blessed having acquired those words, even if it was through a really bad situation. Here I am, 14, 15, 16, in my first power exchange relationship, where I learned that afterwards, I was like, I look back and go, wow, that was either a really abusive relationship, or I learned profound amounts of knowledge, both on a kink perspective and in a sacred and pagan perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? Because both can be true. I can hold both of those at once.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was part of my journey. And I had a fake ID and got involved in the public kink community when I was 16. And as a note, about a decade ago, I started going around and apologizing to every single event producer and play partner I put at risk.
Mm.
Oh,
they
yeah.
didn't know I was under 18. I unethically involved them in a situation they did not consent to. So I went around and started apologizing. But I joke that finding the kink community saved my life because I was doing physical and emotional practices that were not okay. I didn't know about things like safe words. First time I saw it, I was like, hey, what just happened there? And this woman next to me was like, oh yeah, she just used her safe word. And my response was, what does that mean to you? Because this is 1996.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? There's not a construct to, there's literally s01e04 had just come out.
Mm-hmm.
And so this then ties into my experience with sacred kink.
Mm-hmm.
The first time at a public kink space that I got flogged, right? A flogger is a single handle, many tails, usually made out of leather. People think of cat of nine tails, which have knots at the end and are only nine tails. The flogger has a much broader definition. First time I get flogged by a gentleman, I'm up against a St. Andrew's cross. I'm already, as a note, using religious iconography unconsciously in the shit that I was doing, right? A flogger or flail being used against a Christian item of punishment. This guy's flogging me. And I have this moment of pure clarity. The lights go white inside my spirit, and it is blank and empty. And that I am a receptive vessel in the same feeling I get, that same taste I get when I am doing oracular oracle transference workings, future readings, and taking in messages from other realms. Same experience, even if I wasn't doing the thing. And afterwards I said, oh my gosh, that was so amazing. It was just like when I experience things when I'm dancing in groves and have that openness to be able to receive the gods. Wow. And this dude looks at me and goes, it was just a flogging.
So was it?
But it wasn't for me.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't for me. And I went like that was 96. And I started going looking for people who were doing this stuff who said this wasn't just a flogging.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So having that happen within the first couple of months of going to events, I think gave me, in combination with the argument my parents had, gave me this blessing that other people didn't get. Like it didn't all come from happy places, but it is a thing that put my feet on the path I needed to be on.
So in Greek, there is a term kenosis, which is kind of what you just described, Lee, which is a spiritual kinesthetic emptying of oneself to make space for the divine. Having this experience, where you just described, where you felt as if you were emptied and ready to be filled. Was it your journey through kink that you were looking to be filled, or did something begin to fill you and then that filling then moved you into the search for similar spaces?
So that's a complex answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I refer to myself as being a God slave. And when I use the word slave, I acknowledge the traumatic history and current practices of people being enslaved into structures that are non consensual and deeply harmful, that hold our history, especially in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But when I am using the word, I am using it out of a kink context of people choosing to be in authority transfer relationships involving possession, ownership, and agreement to follow the journey set forward by the person who is the possessor. But I think of myself as a God slave because Mother Bear, the spirit that many people call Bear throughout histories around the world, is who owns me. I also refer to myself as a spirit worker in ownership and through the line of her wisdom, knowledge, and experience, because I do not use the word shaman based on the fact that I am not Sami. And as a white person in the United States, I think the word shaman is fraught in our culture and how it's used. So, as a spirit worker and God slave, part of what I have been outright told to do, my capital W work, involves this community.
Mm-hmm.
And so the emptying out had already been happening since I was literally 6 years old in preparation for being hers. I can trace the line back of this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I feel very blessed in the ability to be able to discern those points along the path.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because not everybody gets that chance to be able to follow the plot line. And I've had moments of emptying along that path regularly and continuously. And that's why I say, like, oh, this was just like when I danced in Groves.
Mm-hmm.
I already had a reference point from before I got in kink communities. And I use the word communities on purpose because the kink communities that I am part of at, say, Dark Odyssey, in their sacred sex track of people, that is a very different community than when I am going to events at the International Master Slave Conference. That's a very different community. In the same exact way that when we say the pagan community, there is not a pagan community. If we say the Christian community, there is not a Christian community.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
It's all of these communities that use the same word and fly the same flag. And you're just like, what does the LGBT community look like or mean? All I know is that we have a rainbow flag. Beyond that, there's a whole lot of stuff under that umbrella.
And the idea of an agenda is so ludicrous to the people that live in those communities. They're like, look, we don't know what we're doing from day to day, much less, have a major agenda. We just want to live.
My agenda as a transgender person is to stay alive.
Yes.
Right? I would like to get to be 60.
Yeah.
That would be cool. I'm like, that's 15 years to go. Can I make it that far? I joke that the transgender agenda is to help transgender youth become transgender adults.
That's right. Except
That's
that's
it.
not so much of a joke, really. I mean, that comes with that capital W work, in that there are a lot of these marginalized communities, especially now, that are being raised up as somehow wanting to go against other things, against a quote unquote norm, or against like other ways of living, when the truth of the matter is that most of these marginalized communities, no matter what they are just trying to help people like them survive. They just don't want them to have the pain that we had growing up, or to have someone else take it out on them. And actually, that leads very nicely into, as you were talking, a couple of things that really stood out to me. One, you talked about that experience emptying you, and other experiences, even though the experience of homelessness and the experience of a potentially abusive relationship weren't happy experiences, they were meaningful. And we're drawing spirituality from it. That is a relationship with kink. That is something that I find very hard to explain to people who are not involved in kink. It's not necessarily about pleasure. And very often it's deliberately not about pleasure. And I think that the lines in spirituality and in sexuality, there are some interconnections there. I'm sure you see them because I've read your books. So I would love to have you talk about them.
So it's interesting that there are, again, we go back to communities that all fly the same flag. There are people for whom the word that gets called kink is hardwired, right? And I see the same thing in polyamory, right? It's hardwired. You've been there your whole life. It's that, not that polyamory is what you chose to do. It's that if you don't do it, the world doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
It's the right, compared to people who are polyamorous for whom, oh, this is a way we can make it work. I can deal with polyamory, or polyamory is a system that I can choose, that I can pull upon. And I see that happen in kink. People for whom they are hardwired for one of the categories under kink. So that category could be power exchange and authority transfer. They're hardwired for it. And some folks are like, oh, yeah, my grandma was hardwired for that shit. She was a service person through and through. It wasn't a chosen thing. It's not that grandpa was taking advantage of her. She was just hardwired that way. And other people for whom they choose it. Oh, this would be a delightful and fun thing to do for a weekend. Or people who are like, I'm really into intense experiences. Folks who are hardwired for it, where they're just like, give me ghost peppers and pierce my bits, right? Like, I want to buckle in for hard experiences. Their spice level is just really high. And other people for whom, you know what, it would be a really good challenge to see what it would be like to get my bits pierced, and if it would be challenging for me, or if it might even be a transcendent experience for me, because it's not my day to day. It is a quote ordeal. Knowing that an ordeal is different for every person. What is a casual Thursday for me is somebody else's once in a lifetime. And vice versa. The first time I ever saw a cuddle party, I was in like head to toe leathers. I walked into this space and they're like, oh, it's a cuddle party. And I'm like, so this is like the warm up for the gangbang and orgy that's happening later tonight. And they're like, no, it's here for cuddling. And I'm like, so you all take off your clothing and rub your bodies against each. And they're like, no, we keep our clothes on and we cuddle. And I'm like, yeah, I don't get it. I gotta leave.
Yeah.
This is weird and extreme for me. Flesh hooks, fine.
I have had this exact same conversation with people. When I first moved to Portland, I was going to do everything. I gave myself a year of really trying things that I hadn't tried before. And one of them was a cuddle party. And that thing pushed my boundaries so much harder than any kink I had ever done. You can pierce me with 50 needles. Okay. You want me to just stay here with my clothes on and let people pet me?
Right.
No, I can't do that. It's just overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Whereas like hook pulls, I've seen people do hook pulls where people actually put hooks through their flesh and then they pull against it with a partner. And that to me, in some ways, I understand it. I understand how that gets you to transcendence. Whereas cuddling, just like, I don't know. Why that seems dangerous, I don't know, but it does to me.
But there is something powerful in that statement, right? This notion of what might be transcendent for one person is something that is off the table for another.
Yeah.
I see that in spiritual practices. The idea for going to the high holidays and fasting for 24 hours and doing so as a way to be able to be closer to the veneration of the divine. For some people, it's like, yeah, no, off the table, too extreme. And others who are like, yeah, fasting is part of my regular practice, that every single holiday that comes, I dive into my connection with faith through abstention of the body. That, yeah, fasting is, of course, part of my practice. And for others, it's totally off the table. And for others, it's just like, no, what I'm going to do is like make cute art of like Jesus and sell it online. And it's going to be really fun and cool. Yeah, no, that is just weird. That is off the table. And I'm just like, but you fast every month. Doodling Jesus is too extreme or weird or off the table. They're both opportunities to connect to the divine. What, like, they're just different paths up the mountain, right? You're going to get anally fisted. You're going to go to a cuddle party. You're going to go doodle for Jesus and you're going to fast. They're all different paths up the mountain.
Yeah. And I get the sense, Lee, that a lot of this, what we're talking about, is kind of the intersection of spiritual practice and how spirituality and practice come together kind of in two ways. One of the ways is that spirituality helps me become a better me. It's a place where I can find healing and solace and calm and connection and transcendence. And at the same time, there is this other current intertwined with that part of spirituality where it intrinsically challenges me to become. It's just grainy enough, it's just jagged enough that it continually pushes me into deeper practice. It pushes me into a better awareness of who I am, why I'm here, where am I going, and that these two components ebb and flow between each other. I think a good example of this is that within Unitarian Universalism, we have these principles that we, as human beings, try to follow. And the first one is we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And when I first stepped foot into a Unitarian Universalist space and saw this as kind of like the first commitment within the spiritual tradition, it was like I shed a lot of this spiritual and religious baggage that I had been carrying. Now, a little bit further along the path, as I kept on working with this denomination and this system, that principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, started to really become abrasive because I found where I was not believing in the inherent worth and dignity of every person by treating others as less than. And so it began to feel kind of that dissonance within myself. And so that's what I'm talking about is in one current, spirituality and religion can be healing and growth inspiring. And then the other one can also be abrasive and growth inspiring, and often at the same time. When we think about kink, how do you see kink as being healing as well as you just described it, kind of boundary pushing?
So I got to be part of a scene unintentionally. A scene is a slang within kink that means it's a thing that has a beginning, an action, and an end, right? Think of it as a scene in theater. It's been pre-scripted or pre-agreed to in some way, shape, or form, though the level that you consent to and plan to, it's just like theater, right? Is it theater sports or is this, Macbeth? Like, what are we doing? I was at an event And I saw some people who were dear friends who had agreed to a quote, no safe word scene. And then the idea that we are going to push ourselves as far as the people want to push each other, and there's no way to get out of it. We are buckled in for the ordeal experience. In the middle of it, actually fairly early on, the person who was receiving this intense physical experience just started screaming, red, red, I was wrong. Please, somebody get me out of this, like this plea. And which one do you do when this is all known people in the community? These are leaders in the community. Who steps in to stop an encounter? And were we supposed to, because we all heard the negotiation, what was supposed to happen? And so I and another friend stepped in and like physically held on to the person who was screaming this out. And the people who were doing things to her had already stopped. Like they'd stepped away. Like there was nothing happening at this point. But she was still having an experience. Later that day, I talked to her and she said, this was the first time in my life I ever said no to something. She had been in regularly abusive relationships, and whether it was work, whether it was relationships, whether it was her hobbies, when people asked her, hey, can you do this one thing? She always said yes. She would make it happen. Even if she didn't want to do the thing, she would make it work for her entire life. And she realized this was the first time in her life, not only had she wanted to say no, she had the courage to say no, and people listened to her. And so when we talk about ordeals and healing, it doesn't have to be an ordeal like hers. The number of people I know whose healing in their life came from the ability to negotiate and or to simply be able to say no, and someone listened to them. Talk about transformation.
Yeah.
Whether it came from something big or something small, the power of being able to say no. Or in a different direction, the ability in kink with power and authority transfer for someone to turn to you and say, I trust you.
Mm-hmm.
I trust you to let me follow you. I believe in your vision. If you're somebody who's been shut down in your life over and over again, consensual dominance, wow, what a gift in healing.
Mm-hmm.
I see these things even in the tiniest ways in kink on a regular basis, but I also see people recreating their traumas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right, where they're just like, oh, this is exactly like what I used to do with my parents. I know what this looks like. I'll do it here in my sexual spaces too.
Yeah.
But I see that happen in faith spaces as well. I have in one of my poems in my poetry book, I have a poetry book called On Starry Thighs, Sacred and Sensual Poetry. And I have a piece in it that says, I will not let my goddess be a dangling god with breasts glued on.
Mm.
Because of the number of folks I know who leave Christianity and enter some sort of goddess worshiping tradition, and they slam their trauma onto her.
Mm-hmm.
Or they paint stories of what their practice is supposed to look like based on what was nailed into them. And there's nothing wrong with Christianity. I love the message of Yeshua ben Yosef, who is referred to as the Christ. I would hang out with that dude.
Yeah.
Talk about a radical, amazing being who, whether he was divine or otherwise, that God that he served and how he served that God and who he was as that God, wow, Christianity is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But the trauma it wraps around it in our culture, and people bring that trauma into wherever they go next. Whether it's atheism, whether it is agnosticism, whether it is paganism, doesn't really matter. What are we doing to heal it? And I think finding those things for us in kink, in sacred sexuality, in polyamory, in our spiritual practices, our sacred workings, I think finding the things that empty us out and let us fill it up again, wherever that is, finding ours is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Father Richard Rohr has this great quote, and I think I've said this on the podcast before, which is brokenness untransformed will become brokenness transmitted. And
Ooh.
I hear, Lee, I hear that's kind of what you're saying. We as human beings, we bring our brokenness, whether it's from one system into another, whether it's an abuse that we suffered as children and now that we're adults, and that spirituality and sexuality and kink and all these different technologies can be technologies that help us transform our brokenness before we begin transmitting it around.
Yeah.
And maybe that's one thing that we see a lot of today is we see a lot of people spiritually and physically bleeding out all over each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it even happens in the kink and spiritual space.
Yeah.
We were talking about this before we started recording, is the fact that, and you and I both know this, Lee, if you get into a kink space and you start talking about spirituality, people might look at you funny. Same thing as if you walked into a church and started talking about flogging. People are going to look at you kind of funny. They're bringing their own judgment to that. And that can actually be dangerous.
I went to a pair of speeches that were done by Laura Antoniou and Master Skip Chasey.
Yeah.
And Laura's the author of the Marketplace series, and Skip has been a speaker and an active part of the Metropolitan Community Church for a long time. And Laura's speaking, and then invites Master Skip up, and she pulls that spray out of her pocket, and it says "woo, anti-woo woo." Right? Anti-woo. And she sprays it at him and sprays it on herself, being like, keep the woo away from me. It's interesting that was displayed on the main stage of a conference, right? Yeah. Him showing up representing sacred and spiritual experience as a Christian man of leather, and her representing well-known presentations of kink, being actively against it. Master Skip talks about when I'm not remembering her name, when the new head for the MCC, after the very first one passed away. She was the first to ever be appointed, because the other one was somebody who founded it. She came to him and said, I would like you to be at my installment. It was going to be happening at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And everybody will be there in their full vestments. And he said, I want you to think about what you're asking of me, because I will be there in my full vestments. And she's just like, I hear out of that there's a meaning behind it. Please tell me what your vestments look like. And he said, leather boots and leather pants, a leather belt, a button-down shirt and a leather vest, a leather tie, and a leather cover or military hat atop it all. The vest has pins of my sacred association and a patch on the back involving sacred association, intersecting between sexuality and spirituality. And she said, and this is me recounting the story from when he was on my podcast back in the day. I need time to think about that. And he's like, yeah, because I represent a part, if the MCC is part of the LGBT community, I represent a part of the gay men's community especially, but LGBTQ-ness in general, that is not often given stage time, because we are taboo, wrong, and inappropriate to have on a main stage. She said, yeah, I've got to think about that. Basically, did she want sex to be present at a statement of MCC? Whether people are kinky, have sex or not, is not the point. The visual is something that is associated. Even showing up in a leather vest at a pride parade is considered a sexual presentation, even if they're not doing anything. And she came back to him a while later and said, I would like you there specifically because you represent a part of our sacred and spiritual community. I want you there. And so he was there at the installment. And I think that's such an interesting concept of making an active choice as a faith leader, making an active choice about whether our faith is desexualized. Because she wasn't saying, I want you to be having kinky sex at church.
Yeah.
She was saying, in some ways, in my opinion, when I read that story, this is not what they were saying at all, But when I read that oral transmission of that tale that I'm not using the exact words from, when I think about that oral transmission of that tale, it makes me consider which of our faith spaces are desexualized, where I have to not speak about the fact that I'm in a kinky relationship, where I'm in multiple kinky relationships, where I'm polyamorous. I need to not name that. I can only name that I have a spouse. Everybody else has to be on silent. Which of those spaces am I allowed to exist in my fullness?
Yeah.
And I think it's something we get to consider when we think about that intersection.
And in the inverse of that, where are our sexual spaces?
Yeah.
And you describe this, with the anti-woo spray and everything. Where are our sexual spaces which have been despiritualized?
Oh, did my sacred kink class down in Slidell, Louisiana, and afterwards, a Baptist couple came up to me crying, and they said, "You are the first person we have ever seen speak about kink and spirituality who didn't vilify Christianity." They were like, they had actually been told by people in their local group, the group they considered home, told, "You are not a good Christian if you are showing up to a space like this on a Saturday night." And they're like, "Why?" We show up, we engage with each other, we go home, and we wake up at 9 a.m. and go with our kids to church. What is not holy of this practice? What is not sacred? If God has said, "Be betrothed upon each other, and you shall beget joy," how is that not joy, and how is this not of God?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't make sense according to the plot line. But they had been actively told, "You are not a good Christian if you are showing up here." And the only people speaking about this intersection were pagans or Satanists.
Well, no, it's this idea that we touched on it earlier in our conversation where, and probably out of people's brokenness, have a drive to be very fundamentalist about their practices, whether it's kink or sexuality or spirituality or whatever, to be gatekeepers about a practice or another person. And
Right.
one thing that I've experienced about spirituality is that in many ways, religion is the kind of the container that spirituality is put in. The container is never sufficient to hold the experience.
Yeah.
It will always overflow.
Absolutely.
Mm.
There's so many possibilities for joy in that, in bliss and beauty. I am grateful for the opportunity to spill over the definition.
Mm. Yeah, can you say that one more time?
I am grateful for the opportunities to spill over our definition. And there are so many opportunities to move beyond our gatekeeping.
Well, my hope is that discussions like these inspire others to have these similar discussions and to gently and lovingly and also probably hilariously, abrasively challenge that gatekeeping so that all these spaces can embrace the multimodality of what it means to be human, so that our spiritual spaces aren't desexualized and our sexual spaces aren't despiritualized, and that we can bring like kind of our whole selves into these places with what we yearn for.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. This has been such a rich conversation. Thank you both for making space and place and time for it.
There are 100 other things that I want to ask you about, Lee, but just that last thing that you said was so powerful that I don't want to get away from that. So I have to have you back.
I love this plan.
I do want to just note for everybody who is listening, if you want to learn more about Lee and where Lee is teaching and pick up Lee's books, you can go to passionandsoul.com. That's Lee's website. You can see everything there. I don't think I've read all of your books, but I've read almost all of your books, and they are amazing.
Well, it's funny because like people are like, "Oh, I know you from this," or "I know you from this." I've had people who have read all of my transgender and gender stuff who are like, "Wait, you've written other books?" And I'm like, yeah, I do stuff. And people who read the rope bondage stuff are like, wait, you talk about spirituality? And I'm like, look, it's right here. And people who are like the arts people who are like, wait, you did stuff. It's so funny.
I love it. Right? You're spilling over in all directions.
I'm spilling over in all directions.
Thank you. I'm going to give one plug for a recent book of yours, Become Your Own Beloved, A Guide to Delighting in Self-Connection. Anyone who is listening to this podcast and is interested in spirituality and kink and the intersections between all of those really ought to pick up this book, Become Your Own Beloved. It is a great way for you to expand on the concepts that we talk about on this podcast.
Other than the fact that it is about neither of those things.
I know.
Well, I want to be clear that if you are not kinky, it doesn't talk about kink. If you are not spiritual, it doesn't talk about spirituality, but it is also about both of those things. I also am sneaky, and in like chapter 7, I think I explained polyamory 101, but I don't mention polyamory. I've literally had people be like, oh, that's how I was able to tell my mother about poly, is because we talk about our relationship with ourselves and then our relationship with others. Oh, look, there's 3 relationships. And I'm like, yeah, because sometimes if we use words like polyamory, people get scared and run away. So why not talk about it in the framework of love?
That's right. The book is about finding yourself and becoming like your own primary connection, I would say. Everything that I have experienced spiritually and sexually on both sides has proven to me over and over and over again. If I don't have that good, positive, compassionate, loving relationship with myself, nothing else falls into place.
Right.
I figure anybody who's coming and listening to our podcast at the heart is really wanting to find themselves. And that's why I wanted to recommend the book.
Thank you so much, Lee, for joining us. And a quote that's attributed to St. Francis is, preach the gospel every single day and only when necessary, use words. Thank you for what you do in the world and who you are, and for sharing a little bit about yourself with us.